The Concord Hall on Aethys Prime was the largest structure ever built by any civilization in the known galaxy. And tonight, every seat was filled. 4,000 species had sent their representatives to this emergency session, and the air hummed with 1,000 different languages, all being translated at once through neural implants and floating speaker drones that drifted like fireflies between the rising tiers of the amphitheater. At the very bottom of the hall, in the lowest tier, where the ceiling pressed close and the lights were dim, sat the human delegation. This was not an accident. The lowest tier was reserved for what the Concord called premature civilizations, species that had been granted provisional membership but had not yet proven themselves worthy of full standing. And in the 40 years since first contact, humanity had never been allowed to climb higher than this small cluster of uncomfortable seats near the floor. Okonkwo sat in the center of the human delegation, with her hands folded on the table in front of her, and her back perfectly straight. And if the insult of their placement bothered her, her face did not show it. She was a tall woman in her early 60s, with silver hair cut short and dark skin that caught the bluish light of the chamber. And she had served as Earth's voice in this hall for 11 years, which meant she had 11 years of practice keeping her expression calm, while alien diplomats said terrible things about her species. Tonight would test that practice like never before. The emergency session had been called by the Valith hegemony, and everyone in the galaxy knew what that meant, because the Valith did not call emergency sessions for small matters. They were an insectoid coalition that controlled more star systems than any other single power in the Concord. And when they spoke, the galaxy listened. The Valith speaker rose from the upper tier, its segmented body clicking as it unfolded to its full height of nearly 3 meters, and the translation systems carried its words to every ear in the chamber. The Concord faces a contamination, it began, and Miriam felt her delegation tense beside her, because they all knew what was coming. A species was admitted to this body 40 cycles ago, on the promise that it would learn and adapt and grow beyond its violent and primitive nature. But that species has failed in every measure. The speaker's compound eyes swept the chamber, and then locked downward toward the lowest tier. Humanity is a stain on this Concord. The words hit like a physical blow, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the upper tiers like wind through tall grass. What followed was the worst 2 hours of Miriam Okonkwo's career. One by one, representatives of dozens of species rose to denounce Earth, and each one found a new wound to open. The Rathani collective called humans genetically incomplete, because they lacked the bioluminescent caste markers that most advanced species use to identify social rank. And they presented holographic images of human cities and called them organized filth. The Telluri Dominion played recordings of human wars and projected them across the ceiling of the chamber, so that every delegate could watch tanks rolling through burning streets and soldiers firing weapons at each other. And the Telluri narrator spoke over the footage with a voice dripping with disgust, asking how any species that still killed its own kind could be trusted among the stars. The Urani Federation attacked human culture itself, claiming that human music and language and entertainment had been spreading to younger species like a disease, corrupting their development. And they played clips of alien teenagers on distant worlds listening to human songs and wearing human-style clothing, and they spoke of this as if it were a plague. Speech was met with applause and clicks and hums of approval from the upper tiers, and each time the sound crashed down on the human delegation like a wave. But the worst moment did not come from an enemy. It came from a friend. The Dorvani had been Earth's first allies in the galaxy, the species that had sponsored humanity's application to the Concord 4 decades ago. And when the speaker called upon the Dorvani representative to address the chamber, Miriam turned in her seat, with something she rarely allowed herself in this hall, which was hope. The Dorvani diplomat was an elderly being with pale blue skin and 4 gentle eyes, and Miriam had shared meals with him and called him a friend, and she waited for him to speak in humanity's defense. He did not speak. He simply lowered his gaze to the floor in a slow and deliberate motion that every species in the galaxy recognized as a gesture of abandonment. And then he sat down in a roar of vindication, and Miriam felt something cold settle in her chest. The Valith speaker called for a formal vote on a motion to revoke humanity's provisional membership, quarantine the Sol system, and recall all human vessels from Concord space within 1 standard cycle. The vote was overwhelming, 3,874 in favor, 12 against. It was done. The speaker then turned to the human delegation and offered what it called a customary courtesy, which was 90 seconds for the condemned species to make a final reply. The chamber quieted, and 4,000 alien delegations looked down at the lowest tier, with expressions ranging from pity to contempt to amusement, and they waited to hear humanity beg. Miriam Okonkwo stood. She looked up at the vast amphitheater rising above her, at the thousands of faces and eyes and sensory organs all pointed in her direction, and she felt the weight of 8 billion people on her shoulders. She used 12 of her 90 seconds. "You will remember this night," she said, and her voice was steady and clear, and carried to every corner of that enormous hall. "I promise you that." Then she turned and walked out. The hall exploded in laughter, cruel and loud and echoing, and the sound followed her delegation through the corridors of Aethys Prime, all the way back to the docking bay where the human cruiser Prometheus waited. The laughter was still ringing in her ears when the airlock sealed behind her, and the ship's captain met her in the corridor with a grim face. Miriam did not pause, and she did not explain, and she did not allow herself to feel anything yet. She walked to the secure communications room at the heart of the ship, and she opened a channel that connected to a facility buried deep beneath the Andes Mountains on Earth. A facility that officially did not exist, and she spoke 1 sentence into that. "Light the fires." On the other end, in a room filled with screens and officers who had waited 40 years for this moment, a man named General Constantine Zheng heard those 3 words and closed his eyes for just 1 second. Then he opened them and turned to his staff and said, "Begin." And deep beneath the mountains, something that had been sleeping for a very long time started to wake up. 40 years earlier, when the first alien ship appeared in the sky above Geneva, and the world held its breath, humanity had made a choice that would shape everything that came after. The Dorvani had come with open hands and warm smiles, and an invitation to join a galactic community of thousands of civilizations. And the leaders of Earth had smiled back and said yes, and thanked them for their generosity. And behind closed doors, every major government on the planet had reached the same cold conclusion within the first 6 months of contact. The galaxy was not kind, and it was not fair, and the only thing that mattered out there among the stars was power. It was not hard to figure this out, because the evidence was everywhere, once you knew where to look. The Concord spoke of cooperation and shared progress, but the elder species controlled all the important technology, and all the important trade routes, and all the important decisions, and younger species were kept dependent on them through carefully managed access to knowledge. And anyone who stepped out of line was quietly crushed or loudly humiliated as an example to others. Earth had been given the role of the grateful newcomer, the primitive species that should feel honored just to be allowed in the room. And every treaty humanity signed was designed to keep them exactly where they were, which was at the bottom. The leaders of Earth understood this, and they made a decision. They would play the part. They would smile and bow and accept every insult and every unfair trade deal and every condescending lecture about how humans needed to mature before they could be trusted with real responsibility. And while they did all of this, they would be working. The project was called Hearthfire, and it was the most ambitious and most secret undertaking in human history. Every nation on Earth contributed to it, and for 40 years, not a single leak reached alien ears, which was itself a miracle that proved something the galaxy had failed to understand about humans, which was that when they had a common enemy, they could be remarkably united. The Hearthfire complex was buried beneath the Andes Mountains, in a facility that stretched for kilometers in every direction, and it employed over 200,000 scientists and engineers and military personnel, and its purpose was simple. Take everything the aliens had given humanity, figure out how it worked, and then make it better. This turned out to be easier than anyone expected, and the reason was something that would have horrified the elder species if they had known. Alien technology had stopped advancing. The Valith had perfected their weapon systems 8,000 years ago and had not made a single meaningful improvement since then. And the Rithani had been using the same shield generators for 12,000 years, and the Talari had been flying the same basic ship. Designs for so long that no one could even remember when they had last changed. These civilizations had reached a point of comfort and stayed there, and they saw no reason to push further, because what they had was good enough, and it had always been good enough, and it would always be good enough. Humans did not think this way. Humans looked at a piece of alien technology and immediately began asking how it could be faster and stronger and smaller and more efficient, and they ran experiments and argued with each other and failed and tried again and failed and tried again. And within a decade they had not just matched the alien technology, but had begun to surpass it. General Constantine Zheng had been placed in command of Hearthfire's military division 15 years ago, and he was a patient man with a sharp mind and a face that rarely showed emotion, and he had overseen the development of 4 breakthrough technologies that would change the balance of power in the galaxy forever. The first was the Cascade Drive, a faster-than-light engine that was 3 full generations ahead of anything in the Concorde, and a ship equipped with a Cascade Drive could cross distances in hours that would take alien vessels days. The second was the Phantom Net, an undetectable communications network that human engineers had been quietly weaving through galactic space for 20 years, threading invisible relay nodes through asteroid fields and gas clouds, and the empty spaces between stars. And by the time the Council voted to shame humanity, the Phantom Net covered nearly a third of the known galaxy, without anyone noticing it existed. The third was the Aegis Field, a shield technology that did not simply block incoming energy weapons the way alien shields did, but instead absorbed that energy and stored it and could redirect it back at the attacker, which meant that every shot fired at a human ship only made that ship more dangerous. Was the fleet. Not the small collection of patrol ships and cargo haulers that the Concorde knew about, the modest little force that the aliens pointed to as proof that humans were too weak to matter, but a real fleet, a war fleet, built in secret in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter under holographic camouflage that made the construction yards look like empty space. 1,200 warships, each one equipped with cascade drives and Aegis fields and weapon systems that the galaxy had never seen, crewed by men and women who had trained for years in silence and secrecy, and who understood exactly what was at stake. For 40 years Hearthfire had been waiting, and the people who worked in that mountain had begun to wonder if the signal would ever come. Now General Zheng stood in the command center and watched the footage from the council chamber, watched the alien delegates laugh at Ambassador Okonkwo as she walked out. And he felt something shift inside his chest that was not quite anger and not quite satisfaction, but something in between. He turned to his staff, the officers and scientists who had given their careers and their youth to this project, and he saw the same feeling reflected in every face in the room. 40 years of smiling while they spat on us, he said quietly, and his voice carried through the silent room like a stone dropped into still water. "I think we have been patient enough." He turned to the main console and entered the activation codes that only 3 people on Earth knew, and deep in the asteroid belt, 1,200 ships began powering up their engines. And across a third of the galaxy, the Phantom Net hummed to life, and in orbit around Earth, satellites that everyone thought were weather monitors opened hidden panels and revealed antenna arrays that could broadcast to every corner of known space. The general looked at the clock on the wall. Dawn on Aethys Prime was 7 hours away. That was more than enough time. He picked up a secure communicator and connected to the Prometheus, where Ambassador Okonkwo was sitting alone in her quarters, with her hands still steady and her eyes dry. "Ambassador," he said, "the fires are lit." "Good," she replied, and there was something in her voice that the aliens in that council chamber would not have recognized, because they had never heard a human speak with that particular kind of quiet and absolute resolve. Then let us show them what they woke up. The celebrations had barely begun when the silence hit. On Aethys Prime, the delegates were still congratulating each other on the vote, still laughing about the human ambassador's empty promise, still raising glasses and clicking mandibles and flashing bioluminescent patterns of triumph. When every communication relay within 500 light-years of Sol went dark at the same moment. It did not happen gradually, and it did not happen with warning. 1 second, the galaxy's vast instantaneous communication network was humming along, as it had for millennia, carrying trillions of messages per second across the stars, and the next second, a massive section of it simply stopped working. Screens flickered and went blank, and urgent calls dropped into nothing, and data streams that had been flowing without interruption for thousands of years suddenly hit a wall of empty silence. The effect was immediate, and it was terrifying. The Concord had not experienced a communications blackout of this scale in recorded history, and within minutes the council chamber on Aethys Prime had shifted from celebration to confusion to something very close to panic. The Violet speaker demanded answers from the station's technical staff, and the technicians ran their diagnostics and came back with faces that had gone pale, or the equivalent of pale for species that did not have blood the same color as humans. The relays were not destroyed, they reported, and they were not malfunctioning, and they had not been damaged by any natural phenomenon. They had been shut off. Someone had reached into the most secure and most protected infrastructure in the galaxy and had simply turned it off like a light switch. And the technicians could not figure out how, and they could not turn it back on. While the council was still trying to understand what was happening, the second phase began. At 14 critical junction points across Concord. Space. Places where major trade routes intersected, and where military fleets were stationed, and where the flow of commerce and information converged. Ships appeared out of nothing. They did not arrive through normal faster-than-light travel, which left detectable energy signatures that sensor arrays could track, and they did not emerge from any known transit corridor. They simply appeared, as if they had been there all along, and had only now decided to let themselves be seen. They were human ships. Each one was larger than anything the Concord had on record for humanity's fleet, and their hulls were sleek and dark, and covered in geometric patterns that pulsed with a faint blue light, and they radiated energy signatures that made alien sensors scream with readings that should not have been possible. There were 14 of them, one at each junction point, and they did not fire a single weapon, and they did not make a single threatening move. They simply sat there in the void, visible and undeniable, and they broadcast a data packet. The packet was sent simultaneously to every station and ship and colony and outpost within range, which, thanks to the Phantom Net that no one had known existed until this very moment, turned out to be a very large portion of the galaxy. The data packet contained 3 things. Was a complete set of technical schematics for every classified weapon system held by the top 50 military powers in the Concord, laid out in precise detail, with notes on manufacturing processes and materials and operational parameters. And every single one of these schematics was supposed to be the most closely guarded secret of its respective civilization. The message was clear, without needing to be stated. Earth had penetrated every major intelligence network in the galaxy, and they had done it so thoroughly and so quietly that no one had ever suspected. The second item in the packet was a detailed military analysis of each of those 50 species, identifying their strategic vulnerabilities and defensive weaknesses and supply chain dependencies with the kind of precision that could only come from years of careful study. And reading it was like reading your own autopsy report, written by someone who knew you better than you knew yourself. The third item was a message, written in simple language and translated into every known tongue in the galaxy. It read, "We could have used this information at any time during the past 40 years, and we chose not to. And we ask you to consider what that says about us, and to consider what tonight says about you." The effect of this data packet on the galaxy was like dropping a bomb made of pure truth. On Aethys Prime, the council chamber descended into chaos, as delegates scrambled to verify whether the schematics of their own species' weapons were accurate. And one by one, they confirmed that they were, down to the last detail. And the realization of what this meant spread through the chamber like fire through dry wood. Every military secret they had, every advantage they thought they held, every classified project they had spent centuries protecting, had been known to the humans all along. And the humans had never used it, and had never threatened anyone with it, and had never even hinted that they had it. Meanwhile, the quarantine enforcement fleets that several species had dispatched towards Sol, with such confidence just hours ago, were sending back panicked reports. They had encountered the human armada in the outer reaches of the Sol system, and the readings were beyond anything they had been prepared for. 1,200 warships hung in the darkness between the planets, each one radiating power levels that dwarfed the alien vessels, each one equipped with technology that the alien sensors could barely comprehend. And the alien fleet commanders ran their calculations and looked at the numbers and reached a very simple conclusion. They could not win. Not even close. The alien fleets did not retreat because no one had given them orders to retreat. And the communication blackout meant they could not easily contact their governments for new instructions. So they did the only thing that made sense. They stopped. They powered down their weapons, and they held their positions, and they waited. And the human fleet made no move toward them, and no threatening gesture, and simply waited as well. And between the two forces, there was only the cold dark of space, and a silence that spoke louder than any weapon ever could. Back on Aethys Prime, 5 hours before dawn, Ambassador Miriam Okonkwo walked back into the council chamber. The laughter that had followed her out was gone now, replaced by a noise that was something like the sound of 4,000 species all trying to talk at once, while also trying not to show how afraid they. She walked down to the lowest tier, to those same uncomfortable seats near the floor, and she sat down and folded her hands on the table in front of her, exactly as she had done before. She did not smile, and she did not gloat, and she did not say a single word. She simply sat there and waited for dawn, and every eye in that chamber was on her, and for the first time in 40 years, the humans were not being looked down upon. They were being looked at with something the galaxy had never felt toward them before, and it was not respect, not yet, but it was the thing that comes right before respect. It was the sudden and terrible understanding that you have made a very serious mistake. The hours before dawn on Aethys Prime were the longest that anyone in the council chamber could remember, and the station's artificial sky was still dark when the Concorde began to tear itself apart. It did not happen with weapons or with violence, but with something far more destructive, which was the truth. The data packet that the human ships had broadcast across the galaxy contained more than just military secrets. And as the delegates and their governments began to dig deeper into the mountain of information that humanity had dumped into their laps, they found something that changed everything. Buried among the weapon schematics and vulnerability assessments was a collection of files that detailed 40 years of secret manipulation by the Valith hegemony. And these files told a story that many younger species had long suspected but never been able to prove. The Valith had been sabotaging the development of younger civilizations for centuries. Had done it carefully and quietly and with great patience, inserting subtle errors into the technological packages they shared with new Concord members, placing agents on advisory councils to steer policy in directions that kept young species dependent, manipulating trade agreements to ensure that no one could ever accumulate enough resources to challenge the established order. It was not a conspiracy theory, and it was not speculation, because the Human Intelligence Network had been watching and recording and documenting every move the Valith made for decades, and the evidence was thorough and detailed and undeniable. When this information reached the delegates of the younger species, the ones who had been struggling for millennia to advance and had always been told that their slow progress was their own fault, the reaction was fury. The Pelori, a reptilian species that had been a Concord member for 6,000 years and had never once been allowed to develop their own faster-than-light technology because the Valith kept finding reasons to delay the transfer of knowledge, were among the first to rise in the council chamber and demand an explanation. The Valith speaker tried to dismiss the accusations as human fabrication, but the evidence was too detailed and too specific, and other elder species began quietly distancing themselves from the hegemony, because the data packet had exposed their secrets too, and no one wanted to be the next target of public outrage. While the council chamber boiled with accusations and denials, a different kind of conversation was happening in the corridors and private rooms of Aethys Prime. The 12 species that had voted against expelling humanity, the tiny minority that had stood with Earth when standing with Earth meant nothing, were moving from delegation to delegation with a message. These 12 were all younger species, civilizations that had made quiet contact with humanity over the years through back channels and unofficial meetings, species that had traded ideas and art and scientific theories with humans and had come to understand something that the elder powers had missed entirely. Humanity was not a threat to the galactic order. Humanity was the key to changing it. A Dorvani diplomat named Caleth sought out Ambassador Okonkwo in a quiet corridor near the lower tiers, and he approached her with his 4 eyes lowered and his hands open in the Dorvani gesture of deepest shame. He was the same diplomat who had abandoned humanity in the chamber hours ago, the one Miriam had called a friend. And now he stood before her and spoke in a voice that trembled. He told her that the Valith had threatened to destroy 3 Dorvani colony worlds if the Dorvani spoke in defense of Earth. And he told her that he had chosen the safety of his people over his loyalty to hers. And he told her that he was sorry. Time and the silence between them held the weight of 11 years of friendship and 1 night of betrayal. "I understand why you did it," she said at last, and her voice was not warm, but it was not cruel. "And someday you will have the chance to earn back what was lost tonight. But that day is not today." Caleth nodded and lowered his eyes again and walked away, and Miriam watched him go and allowed herself 1 moment of sadness before she buried it and turned her attention back to what mattered. The coalition of younger species was growing by the hour. What had started as 12 votes had swelled to over 200 as more and more delegations read the evidence of Valith manipulation and realized that the entire power structure of the Concord had been built on lies, and these species were not rallying around humanity out of fear of human weapons or human technology. They were rallying because the humans had done something that no one in the history of the Concord had done before. Concord had ever done before. They had taken secrets and made them public. And they had taken power and offered to share it. and they had taken a moment of absolute advantage, and used it not to conquer, but to illuminate. A formal petition was drafted and signed by 214 species, requesting that humanity not only remain in the Concord, but be elevated to full membership, with a permanent seat on the Senior Council. And the petition stated that Earth had demonstrated the qualities that the Concord claimed to value, but had never actually practiced, which were transparency and courage and a commitment to the advancement of all species, rather than just the powerful few. The Valith were furious, and behind the scenes, 3 elder species were quietly repositioning their war fleets, testing whether there was a military solution to the problem that humanity had created. General Zheng saw the fleet movements on his screens aboard the command ship in the Sol system, and he studied them with the calm focus of a man who had been planning for this exact scenario for 15 years. His officers watched him and waited for orders, and some of them were eager because they had spent their careers training for a fight that they believed was inevitable. But Zheng shook his head. "Hold position," he said. "All ships maintain defensive formation, weapons cold, shields at ready, but not active." One of his officers, a young captain named Torres, spoke up carefully and asked if they should not at least power up their weapons as a deterrent. Zheng turned to her, and his expression was patient but firm. "Captain, we have spent 40 years proving that we are not what they say we are, and we are not going to throw that away in the last few hours by being the ones who escalate this, because the moment we power up our weapons, we become exactly what they accused us of being, and then everything we have built means nothing." Turned back to his screens. "Let them come to us," he said quietly. "We do not throw the first punch. We never have, and that is not weakness, Captain. That is the whole point." Torres nodded and said nothing more, and the human fleet held its position in the dark between the planets, 1,200 ships burning with enough power to reshape the galaxy, all of them waiting with their weapons cold, and their crews steady, and their patience unbroken. On Aethys Prime, the artificial sky was beginning to lighten at the edges, the first pale hints of a dawn that was still an hour away, and Ambassador Okonkwo sat in her seat in the lowest tier of the council chamber, and watched the galaxy rearrange itself around her. She had not slept, and she was not tired, because there would be time for sleep later, and right now history was being written, and she intended to be present for every word of it. Dawn came to Aethys Prime the way it always did, with a slow sweep of golden light that moved across the station's enormous viewport windows, and filled the council chamber with warmth that felt almost real. And on any other morning, the delegates would have barely noticed it, because they had seen it thousands of times before. But this was not any other morning, and every being in that chamber felt the light touch their skin, or scales, or chitin, and understood that something fundamental had changed in the hours of darkness, and that the galaxy they woke up to was not the same galaxy they had gone to sleep in. The Valith speaker called the council to order one final time, and its voice was harder now, and sharper, and stripped of the smooth confidence it had carried the night before, and it made its last move. "I invoke the Annihilation Clause," it declared, and the chamber went absolutely silent. The Annihilation Clause was the most extreme measure in the Concord's charter, a provision that had existed since the founding of the Alliance, but had only been invoked twice in all of galactic history, and it allowed for the complete and total extermination of a species that was deemed an existential threat to the stability of the galaxy. It required a 90% vote to pass. The Valith speaker stood tall and spread its segmented arms wide and looked out over the chamber, with compound eyes that burned with cold fury, and it called for the vote. The numbers climbed on the display screens that floated above the chamber, and delegates registered their choices, and the elder species who had always followed the Valith's lead cast their votes in favor. And for a few terrible seconds, the percentage crept upward. It reached 19%, and then 23%, and then 28, and then it slowed, and then it stopped, and then it did not move again. 31%. The younger species had blocked it, not by a narrow margin but by an overwhelming one, and the coalition of 214 that had formed during the night held firm and voted no. And they were joined by dozens of other species who had spent the dark hours reading the evidence of Valith manipulation and had decided that enough was enough. The annihilation clause failed, and the Valith speakers stood frozen at the podium as the numbers glowed on the screen above. And for the first time in anyone's memory, the most powerful species in the galaxy looked small. The council fell into a strange and heavy quiet, and then a voice rose from the lowest tier. "I would like to address the council," said Ambassador Miriam Okonkwo, and she did not ask for permission, and she did not wait to be recognized, because the rules that had governed her behavior for 11 years had burned away with everything else during the night. She stood and walked to the central platform, the raised circle of polished stone, where only senior council members were supposed to stand, and no one stopped her, and no one objected, because there was no one left in that chamber who had the standing to tell her she did not belong there. She looked up at the tiers rising above her, at the thousands of faces looking down, and she began to speak. She did not gloat, and she did not threaten, and she did not list humanity's new weapons, or describe the power of the fleet that waited in the darkness of the Sol system. Instead, she talked about Earth. She talked about the wars, because she was not going to pretend they had not happened. And she described the trenches of the First Great War, and the fires of the Second, and the long cold terror of the Third that never quite became a war, but came close enough to leave scars on every nation. She talked about the way humans had enslaved each other and starved each other, and built empires on the backs of the suffering, and committed acts of cruelty that would make any species in this chamber recoil. And then she talked about what came after. She talked about the people who stood up and said no, the ones who marched and bled and died so that others could be free. And she talked about the movements that swept across continents like wildfire, abolition and civil rights, and the slow, painful, difficult work of looking at your own history and saying, this was wrong, and we will do better. She talked about the scientists who cured diseases that had killed millions, and the engineers who built bridges across rivers that had divided nations, and the artists who created beauty out of suffering, and the ordinary people who chose kindness when cruelty would have been easier. You showed us our wars tonight, she said, and her voice was steady and strong, and carried to every corner of the chamber. You played our worst moments on your screens, and you used them to judge us, and I will not tell you that you were wrong about what you saw. Those things happened, and they are part of who we are. She paused and let the silence hold for a moment. But you only showed half the story, because every war you displayed was followed by a peace that we built with our own hands, and every act of cruelty was answered by an act of courage, and every time we fell, we got back up. And that is the thing about humans that you never understood. Her voice rose, not in anger but in something that was closer to fierce pride. We are not great because we have never failed. We are great because we have never stopped trying to be better. And the proof of that is standing in front of you right now. Because we could have used what we built to burn this Concord to the ground, and no one could have stopped us. And instead we are here, talking to you, offering you the one thing that no power in this galaxy has ever offered before. She reached into her coat and produced a small data crystal and held it up. Light caught it and sent rainbow fragments scattering across the chamber walls. This contains the complete technical specifications for every advancement humanity has made in the past 40 years. Our engines, our shields, our communications network, our medical breakthroughs, our agricultural innovations, everything. And I am offering it to this council freely, without conditions, without cost, without any requirement of loyalty or alliance or submission. The chamber stirred with disbelief, and even the younger species who had supported humanity looked stunned. "We are not doing this because we are generous," Okonkwo continued, "and we are not doing this because we want allies, although allies would be welcome. We are doing this because hoarding knowledge is what dying civilizations do, and we intend to live." She set the crystal on the podium and stepped back. What followed was not a single dramatic moment, but a cascade of smaller ones that together added up to something the galaxy had never seen. The Valith hegemony and 6 elder species announced their withdrawal from the Concord, and their delegations filed out of the chamber in bitter silence. And as they left, the seats they had occupied for millennia stood empty. And somehow, the chamber did not feel smaller for their absence, but larger. The motion to expel humanity was formally rescinded by a vote of the remaining delegates, and in its place, a new motion was introduced, not by humans, but by the Pelori, the reptilian species that had been denied faster-than-light technology for 6,000 years. The motion called for the dissolution of all existing treaties that maintained unequal power structures within the Concord. Every trade restriction, every technology embargo, every provision that gave elder species control over younger ones, all of it. And it called for a new charter to be written, one that treated every member species as an equal, regardless of how long they had been among the stars. The vote was not even close. The old treaties, the ones that had kept humanity at the bottom of the chamber and kept 100 other species in chains they could not see, burned away like paper in a fire, and in their place was something new and fragile and uncertain, but alive with possibility. Ambassador Okonkwo watched the vote from the central platform, and she felt the weight of the moment settle over her like a warm coat after a long cold night. And she allowed herself to feel, for just 1 second, the enormity of what had happened. Her earpiece crackled, and General Zheng's voice came through from across the stars. "Not a single shot fired," he said, and she could hear something in his voice that might have been wonder. She looked out through the viewport at the artificial dawn washing over Aethys Prime in gold and amber, and she allowed herself one small smile, the first since she had walked out of this chamber. Lifetime ago. That was always the point, she said. The Concord did not end that morning, but it was reborn, and in the years that followed, the galaxy would look back on this night as the moment when everything changed, when a species that had been mocked and shamed and laughed at by the most powerful civilizations in existence stood up and showed them what strength really looked like. It did not look like weapons, although the humans had those. It did not look like conquest, although the humans could have done that. It looked like a woman standing in a hall full of beings who had tried to destroy her people, holding out a crystal full of miracles, and saying, "Here, this is yours, because we would rather lift you up than push you down." They had called humanity children, savages, a mistake of evolution that should never have been allowed among the stars. But the stars have long memories, and the galaxy would not forget the species that burned every cage ever built for them, and then offered the ashes as kindling for a better fire.